Let's go back tens of thousands of years, to a time before history, before cities, before written words. A time when fire wasn't just warmth, it was survival. So if you're hearing my voice right now, I'd like to start by welcoming you. Maybe it's late at night and you're winding down. Maybe you're bundled under warm covers, the lights dim, your mind ready to wander. Or maybe you've just had a long day and you're searching for something calm and immersive to drift away to. Whatever the time is where you are, and wherever you're listening from, leave a comment and let me know. I'd really love to hear it. It helps this small channel grow, and it lets me know who I'm keeping company with in these long, quiet hours. If you enjoy this kind of storytelling about our deep, shared human past, consider subscribing. Every time you do, it brings this little project to more people like you. Now let's begin. Imagine, for a moment, the cold. Not the kind of chill that slips under your coat in autumn. No. Picture the kind of cold that settles in your bones, that turns the earth hard as stone and the rivers to glass. This was Ice Age Europe, some 40,000 to 80,000 years ago. Vast glacial winds swept across open plains. Mammoths trudged through snowbanks, taller than a man. At night, the stars above hung so bright and so still, they seemed etched into the sky. And somewhere, nestled against the dark of a cave, or behind a wall of mammoth bones stacked for shelter, a group of early humans huddled around the flickering amber light of a fire. That flame was everything. Without it, there would be no warmth, no light, no cooked food, no protection from predators. But here's what most people never consider. Fire had to be made. It had to be kept. And learning how to make fire wasn't easy. It took patience, practice, and perhaps most important of all, it took passing knowledge from one generation to the next. The earliest controlled use of fire likely dates back far earlier than most people think. At a site called Gesher Banat Yaakov, in modern-day Israel, archaeologists discovered evidence of burned wood and seeds, dating back nearly 780,000 years. That's long before Homo sapiens. We're talking Homo erectus here, our distant ancestors. But there's a difference between using fire and making fire. Early hominins probably captured natural fires, lightning strikes, wildfires, and tried to keep the embers alive. Maybe they learned how to insulate coals with dung, ash, or even rolled up bark. Some anthropologists believe that entire bands of early humans may have followed lightning storms, scavenging for fire like predators following prey. But to make fire on command, that was something else entirely. And by the time of the Neanderthals and early modern Homo sapiens, say around 50,000 years ago, this skill had likely developed in multiple places independently. In Europe, Neanderthals were thriving long before we arrived. And despite popular myths, they weren't primitive brutes. They were intelligent, social, and highly adapted to cold climates. Sites like Pech de la Zay in France show repeated fire use in deep cave layers, suggesting that Neanderthals returned season after season, perhaps even generation after generation, to build their fires in the same hearths. Imagine them, crouched near a pile of flint nodules, striking pyrite against stone until a spark leapt onto a bed of dry fungus or bark fibers. The smell of sulfur in the air, the flicker, faint and precious, swelling into flame as they gently breathed life into it. A child, eyes wide, watching the tiny miracle unfold. A mother feeding twigs into the flame with practiced hands. These weren't chaotic bands. These were families, tied by knowledge passed down through time. Fire wasn't just heat, it was memory, it was ritual. Different methods existed. Some involved friction, rubbing a wooden spindle into a fireboard until the heat generated an ember. Others used percussion, striking stones like flint and pyrite together to produce a spark. But conditions mattered. Wood had to be dry, air had to flow. The material that caught the spark, known as tinder, had to be fine, dry, and delicate. Some groups likely used materials like birch bark, which contains flammable oils. Others may have harvested fungi like Fomes fomentarius, also known as tinder fungus, which was incredibly efficient at catching and holding a slow ember. We know Neanderthals had access to these materials, and we also know they cooked food, possibly smoked meat, and kept fires going for long periods. At the site of Bruniquel Cave, deep in the French countryside, archaeologists discovered what appears to be an intentional circular structure made of broken stalagmites, likely used to maintain fire deep underground. That site is over 176,000 years old. Let that settle in for a moment. Now picture this. It's deep winter in what's now modern-day Germany. A band of Homo sapiens, having recently migrated from warmer climates, seeks shelter in a limestone cave. Outside, snow piles against the trees. The sun hasn't shone in days. Inside, the fire crackles. It's been burning for weeks, fed carefully by rotating shifts. The people speak softly, clicks, murmurs, early proto-language sounds. A boy is learning to tend the fire. His grandfather, weathered and silent, shows him how to stack the wood just so, not too tight, not too loose. They use a carved wooden container to keep a live ember while traveling, wrapped in moss and ash to insulate it. Fire is not just a convenience, it is a legacy. The flame is old, older than memory, older than words, and as the child listens to the wind howl outside the cave, he realizes, so long as that flame burns, they are safe. The fire didn't sleep, even when the people did. It was someone's duty, usually the older children, or an elder with steady hands, to make sure the embers never went out. A smoldering fire could be revived in minutes. A dead fire, in the middle of winter, meant risking everything to find or create another. In the thick of Ice Age winters, fire wasn't just a comfort, it was life insurance. So they guarded it like a sacred heart. Ashes were banked high around the coals to keep them insulated. Sometimes the fire was split, embers taken and started anew nearby, to spread warmth across a cave system or dwelling. In places where families gathered under reindeer hides or behind walls of packed earth and stone, the glow of the fire unified them. It lit faces, cast shadows, warmed marrow, softened meat, and lit the spark of thought that perhaps one day gave rise to myth. It's easy to forget how dangerous the dark was then. There were no flashlights, no torches of paraffin or wax, no roads or distant house lights. When the sun went down, the world turned pitch black, and the shadows came alive. The glow of a fire created a dome of visibility and safety. Lions, cave hyenas, wolves, and bears, many of them larger and more aggressive than their modern relatives, kept their distance from fire. The scent alone likely signaled danger to predators. Some anthropologists argue that fire helped shape our sleep cycles, pushing humans to sleep more deeply and safely through the night, with rotating sentries watching over the hearth. Around the fire, stories were born, not just spoken language, but rhythm, memory, gesture. Picture a group huddled in silence as an elder mimics the hunt, shadows flickering against the cave wall, as they mimic the low growl of a bison or the swoop of a hunting bird. These weren't performances, they were memory passed through movement. Firelight made it visible. Fire made memory immortal. In places like the Grotte du Renne in France, where Neanderthal remains have been found alongside decorated objects and ochre, it's likely that the fire was the centerpiece of their communal life as well. For a long time, people debated whether Neanderthals made art, or if they had symbolic thought, but recent discoveries have challenged those assumptions. We now know they likely buried their dead. They shaped tools carefully, purposefully. They mixed pigments, if they weren't painting cave walls. Perhaps they were painting themselves, or the skins they wore. In either case, fire would have illuminated those rituals. The orange light bouncing off red ochre-stained faces. The dance of shadows on limestone. Their understanding of fire wasn't purely practical. It was emotional, social, even spiritual. You can almost feel it if you close your eyes. The warmth of it on your face, while the outside world is locked in ice. Homo sapiens, meanwhile, adapted quickly to cold climates in Eurasia by blending knowledge of fire with new innovations. Animal fat, especially from large herbivores like mammoths or reindeer, was used as a fuel source, burning slow and hot, They may have used hollowed bones or carved stone bowls as crude lamps, with moss or grass wicks. Charred bones found in Upper Paleolithic sites suggest people used fire, not just for cooking, but for waste disposal, smoke signaling, even food preservation. In permafrost-heavy regions, meat could be hung near fires to smoke dry and last for weeks. Some camps likely burned day and night all winter long, with layers of soot building up on cave ceilings. Archaeologists often use these layers to reconstruct seasonality, whether people stayed year-round or migrated with the animals. But one thing is clear: the mastery of fire was the cornerstone of human expansion into some of the coldest, most forbidding parts of the planet. At sites like Blombos Cave in South Africa, dating back nearly 100,000 years, there's evidence of not just hearths, but ochre processing workshops and engraved stones. These weren't just places of survival. They were places of thought, of reflection, of art. Fire made this possible. The ability to cook food expanded the calories available to early humans, which may have influenced the growth of our brains. Cooked meat, roots, and tubers were easier to digest and extract energy from. That freed up time that would have otherwise been spent chewing or foraging. Time to sit, to think, to speak. Some researchers even suggest that the social bonds formed around fires played a role in the development of language itself. Because at the end of the hunt, when the sun dipped low and the cold crept in, it wasn't just about staying alive, it was about coming together. Sitting shoulder to shoulder, sharing food, passing knowledge, feeling for just a moment that the darkness couldn't reach you. Sometimes I wonder what it must have felt like to be the first in your group to master fire. Not to find it, but to create it. To strike stone against stone. Watch a single spark leap out and see it catch. The quiet gasp, the pause in breath, that first curl of smoke, the flame that grows beneath your hand. And then the fire that lights the faces of your people who had huddled in cold and fear, and now feel warmth on their skin for the first time. That must have been more than a discovery. That was transformation. That was magic. That was power. It changed not just their bodies, but their minds. It changed how they thought of the world, what they could shape, what they could endure, and what they could become. Over time, fire didn't just shape the way people lived. It reshaped the very spaces they lived in. Early humans adapted their shelters to cradle the fire at the center of their existence. In cold climates, some groups constructed low oval structures with central hearths, their roofs supported by mammoth bones, driftwood, or stacked stones, and insulated with animal hides and packed earth. These shelters were more than temporary lean-tos. They were homes. Carefully arranged stones ringed the fire to prevent collapse and contain the heat. Some sites show signs of multiple hearths arranged in specific patterns, which could reflect divisions of labor or family groups within a larger community. The placement of fire wasn't random. It was architectural, designed, thoughtful. A hearth at the center meant shared heat, shared light, shared space. Everything radiated outward from the flame. Sleeping areas, tool storage, food preparation zones. Fire was both anchor and compass. And then there was the smell. The prehistoric world had its own palette of scents: blood, wet fur, rotting leaves, damp earth, but nothing shaped it more vividly than fire. The slow, smoky burn of pine wood, the acrid sting of burning hair, the sweet char of roasted tubers pulled from the coals. Smoke settled into everything. Furs, hair, skin. People carried the smell of fire with them, even when they left the shelter behind. It was a constant companion, woven into their sense of self. There are even theories that long-term smoke exposure may have changed how human lungs and sinuses adapted, especially in regions where fire was used in enclosed cave spaces. The fire hardened their tools, tanned their hides, dried their meats, but it also reshaped their senses. In a world full of predators and danger, the scent of smoke might have become its own kind of signal, a mark of humanity. With fire, humans could reshape the land itself. They weren't just passive foragers moving through nature. They were beginning quietly, subtly, to become engineers of it. In parts of Africa and later Australia, Early humans used fire to clear underbrush, encourage the growth of edible plants, and drive game animals toward traps or hunters. This method, sometimes called fire stick farming, left a lasting imprint on local ecologies. Controlled burns renewed the land, reduced insect populations, and created open grasslands ideal for grazing animals. Though we often think of the Neolithic as the dawn of agriculture, these fire-based manipulations show that even before sowing seeds, humans were shaping ecosystems to suit their needs. Fire gave them more than food. It gave them control, influence, reach, and from that came the first seeds of culture. Planning, foresight, hallmarks of the modern human mind. It's in this context that we can start to see fire, not just as a survival tool, but as something more symbolic, something sacred. Across continents, early cultures left signs that fire may have held ritual meaning. In some caves, fire was used to illuminate paintings that were placed deep underground, far from any natural light. These weren't just decorations, they were deliberate placements, in locations that required crawling, climbing, and carrying fire deep into the earth. Why would they do that? Some researchers believe these journeys into darkness were spiritual, ceremonial, acts of reverence or transformation. Fire revealed the hidden images. It flickered across ochre-painted bison, antelope, strange human-animal hybrids. Perhaps these flickering shapes told stories, or brought protection, or carried the memory of ancestors. Whatever the reason, the act of lighting these spaces with fire suggests that the flame wasn't just practical, it was mystical. In a way, fire was one of the first mirrors. It was the first thing early humans could truly see themselves in, not as reflections, but as patterns of movement and light. Watch a fire long enough, and it dances. It breathes. It seems alive. Maybe that's why so many early mythologies, across vastly different cultures, feature fire as a gift from the gods, or as a stolen treasure. Long before Zeus punished Prometheus, or the Hindu fire god Agni was worshipped in sacred rituals, our ancestors must have looked into the flames and seen more than combustion. They saw meaning, and over time, that meaning deepened. Fire became part of life cycles. Newborns might have been introduced to the hearth for warmth. The dead might have been burned with ceremony. Food wasn't just cooked, it was offered. The hearth was the heart of everything. Even in its smallest form, fire gave shape to the days and nights. When to sleep, when to gather, when to begin a hunt, or return from one. People likely timed their activities, not by clocks, but by the rhythm of the flame. How long it burned, how far the shadows crept, how low the embers glowed. The crackle of fire was background music to early humanity's most profound transitions, from hunger to nourishment, from fear to safety, from cold to warmth. And for all its danger, people respected it. Children were taught to keep a distance, but also to tend it gently. It was feared, yes, but also loved, cared for, passed down. The same way language was, the same way stories were. Fire was never just a tool. It was a relationship. As the flame shaped their world, it also shaped their minds. There is something hypnotic about fire, something that even now draws the eye and quiets the thoughts. The human brain, over thousands of years, likely adapted to this pattern. Soft light, rhythmic crackle, low warmth, associating it with safety, rest, and reflection. Modern studies suggest that sitting near a campfire can lower blood pressure and reduce stress. It slows the heart, encourages deeper breathing. This effect may be ancestral, an echo of a time when fire signaled that predators were kept at bay, that the day's hunt was complete, and that it was time to rest. In those hours around the fire, early humans had the mental space to dream, and with that space came stories, ideas, imagination. The flicker of flame didn't just illuminate the cave walls, it lit the inner world too. Think of the way a group sits around a fire, even now. Faces turned inward, lit from below. Words spoken softly, eyes glancing at each other across the light. It creates intimacy, a shared focus. For early humans, This must have been one of the earliest stages of social bonding, beyond immediate survival. A way to feel close even in silence. A moment to learn by watching. The warmth of a parent's body on one side, the heat of the fire on the other. These moments shaped the next generation. Children watched as flint was struck, as sinew was twisted into cord, as stories were told with hands and glances. Fire didn't just make life possible, it made memory teachable. It was the world's first classroom, not with blackboards and desks, but with stone, light, warmth, and attention. Over thousands of generations, the human body itself began to reflect these changes. With the advent of fire and cooking, jaw sizes shrank, teeth became smaller. The digestive system shifted. Cooked food required less energy to break down. This freed up caloric resources for something else, brain growth. It's not a coincidence that the rapid expansion of hominin brain size occurred in tandem with consistent fire use. Fire allowed for better nutrition, and better nutrition allowed for more complex thought. This in turn led to better tools, better planning, and eventually better communication. Some researchers suggest that fire was the spark, not just of heat, but of culture, of philosophy, of imagination. Once people had fire, they had time to think, to imagine what was beyond the trees, what stars were, what death meant. And with that growth, humans began to press further outward, into colder climates, into harsher seasons. Fire was the reason our species could expand beyond the temperate zones of Africa and survive in places where winter reigned for half the year, in the tundras of Ice Age Siberia or the frozen valleys of northern Europe. Fire gave them the ability to set up camps where no animal could sleep. It dried their furs, cured their food, and kept them from freezing to death while the wind howled outside. Without fire, these migrations would have been impossible. The torch and ember became as important as the spear and stone blade. Fire enabled journeys that changed the shape of humanity's future. Every footstep across a frozen steppe was fueled by the embers cradled in bark and moss. Without fire, the human world would have stayed small, and even in places where it wasn't needed for warmth. Fire was never abandoned. In the warmer savannas and rainforests of Africa, early humans used fire for light, for cooking, for social cohesion. Some researchers have even noted that in tropical regions, fire may have helped reduce parasite loads in food and water, creating healthier communities over time. In every biome humans entered, fire adapted with them. It was the most flexible of all their tools. A flame could be small enough to carry in a handful, or large enough to shape a landscape. It could drive off animals or draw them in. It could be coaxed to life or smothered to embers, and early humans learned to read its moods. A sudden hiss, wet wood, a crackling roar, pine sap igniting, a smoke column that twisted wrong. Maybe it was time to move. Some of the earliest signs of communal fire use are found in East Africa, where bands of Homo erectus built open hearths under the stars. These weren't caves, they were open landscapes. The fire itself was the center of gravity. In places like Kubi Fora in Kenya or Chesawanja, researchers have uncovered burned clay, charcoal, and scorched stones, all suggesting regular, repeated use of fire. These hearths were tended, cleaned, used again, and from that small circle of stones radiated a pattern of life that would echo through all human history. From the savannas to the ice fields, from the mountain valleys to the coastlines, fire came with them, a companion, a guardian, a teacher. The moment humans learned to carry fire into the dark, something extraordinary happened. We extended the day. For most creatures, nightfall meant stillness, rest, waiting. But around the fire, the night became a canvas, a place of story, of reflection, of quiet creation. Flame offered not just warmth and protection, it gave humans the first control over light itself. No longer bound to the rise and fall of the sun, they carved out their own kind of time, a time for cooking, crafting, speaking, resting. The shadows on cave walls danced differently with firelight. Objects took on strange, flickering forms. Faces appeared softer, more expressive. The hearth, glowing at the center of a shelter, became a clock of its own, burning low with the night, rising again with new wood before dawn. These firelit hours, suspended between sleep and waking, were when memories were shared most vividly. Without writing, knowledge had to be passed mouth to mouth, through gesture, song, and story. Fire became the silent witness to this inheritance. Around its glow, hunters described the path of migrating herds. Mothers showed children how to split marrow bones. Elders whispered about stars, seasons, omens, and woven through all of it were the earliest threads of belief. Not religious dogma, not yet, but the beginnings of symbolic thought. Fire inspired wonder. Its flame could vanish in an instant, yet could also be coaxed back with breath and care. It consumed and transformed. It had to be fed like a living thing. In a world where so little was controllable, fire responded. It obeyed, and that made it sacred. Burial sites from the Upper Paleolithic show signs that fire played a role in death rituals. In Sungir, Russia, for instance, bodies were laid to rest with beads, ochre, and ivory spears, symbols of care, identity, and possibly status. Some of these burials show evidence of fire nearby, perhaps used to purify, to mark a transition, or to guide the spirit. In other places, cremation may have occurred, though confirming this is difficult after tens of thousands of years. What we do know is that fire left its mark, not just on bones and hearths, but in how people treated the end of life. It gave them a way to act upon death, to respond to loss with more than silence. The fire continued to burn, even after a life had ended. It was the continuity, the through line, the ritual that could carry the weight of grief. In places like Chauvet and Lascaux, the caves were not just shelters or canvases. They were ceremonial spaces, and fire was the only way to enter them. Deep in those caverns, surrounded by paintings of bison, lions, and horses, people lit torches or burned fat lamps to see. The flicker of the flame animated the art. The painted animals moved as the light moved. Maybe it was a kind of magic. Maybe it was memory. Or maybe it was reverence for the creatures they hunted, for the spirits they believed walked with them. In that sacred darkness, fire was more than illumination. It was transformation, a tunnel into another realm, something remembered only in the warm pulse of coals and the way the soot clung to skin. There's an intimacy to the idea that people tens of thousands of years ago sat in complete silence, listening to the pop of a pine log or the hiss of sap in the fire. That moment, with the wind blocked by stone, the cold held back by flame, and the world reduced to glow and shadow. That moment is still with us. We've changed so much. We've built towers, touched the stars. But that moment, it hasn't changed. It's still there when we sit by a campfire and stare into the center, when we light a candle in a quiet room, when we watch smoke rise and imagine someone, long ago, doing the same thing. That's the lineage of fire. Not just warmth or light, but memory. Even now, fire lives inside our words. We speak of spark when someone shows brilliance. We talk of being burned when we feel emotional pain. Kindling, love, smoldering anger. The language of fire has fused with the language of feeling, perhaps because it always was a feeling. A living symbol, one that burned beside us as we became who we are. One that shaped our faces, our families, our future. Even now, as you lie there listening, the echo of that first flame is still here, woven into the voice, the breath, the stillness of this moment. Fire wasn't just a tool for staying alive. It became a tool for changing the world, literally altering the materials early humans found around them. Once the basics of flame were mastered, curiosity followed. What happens when a rock is left in the coals too long? What does heat do to bone or to a piece of wood? Over time, those quiet experiments, sometimes accidents, led to one of humanity's most powerful discoveries: transformation. Fire wasn't just something you used, it was something you worked with. Heated stone, when cooled rapidly, could fracture into blades with sharper, cleaner edges. That discovery led to better weapons, better scraping tools, and finer points for spears. In places like Kesem Cave in Israel, nearly 400,000 years ago, we find repeated evidence of burned flint, purposefully treated to make it easier to nap. These weren't mindless wanderers, these were technologists. Then came wood. Hardening wooden spears in fire made them stronger, more durable, and more lethal. This is seen in finds like the Schöningen spears from Germany, dating back roughly 300,000 years. These are long, perfectly balanced weapons, made of carefully carved spruce, sharpened and then baked in fire. Not burned, baked. A process that required control, observation, and repetition. Someone, long ago, discovered that if you held the point just close enough to the flame, not in it, but near it, it darkened, stiffened, became something new. Fire made the weapon better. That knowledge was passed on, repeated, maybe even improved over generations. And from that came not just better hunting, but a deeper understanding that fire could do more than destroy. It could refine. By the Upper Paleolithic, fire was integrated into nearly every aspect of life. Adhesives were made from tree resin melted with fire and mixed with charcoal and animal fat, then used to bind stone blades to wooden handles. These compound tools, axes, knives, spears, were complex, multi-part constructions. They required planning, preparation, storage, and timing. You needed fire not just to create the adhesive, but to soften it for use. This was chemistry, born from need and refined through intuition. It's easy to miss the sophistication in these moments, but when you stop and imagine it, a person kneeling beside a fire, gently melting pitch in a stone dish, shaping a tool not just to survive, but to last. You see something very modern flickering beneath, but fire didn't stop with tools. It was also used to shape shelters, to clear land, even to process food in more advanced ways. Tubers and certain wild plants are poisonous or inedible when raw, but heated properly they become safe, and in some cases delicious. One example is the African plant Dioscorea, a type of wild yam that becomes edible only after baking underground for hours. Early humans discovered this, not through textbooks or theory, but through generations of watching, testing, tasting. Fire became a form of knowledge, an interpreter between what nature offered and what humans could actually consume. And so they experimented, not just with survival, but with taste, the beginnings of cuisine. Even pigments were changed by fire. Red ochre, for instance, can be deepened or altered by heating. At Blombos Cave, fragments of ochre with deliberate scraping and scoring marks have been found alongside grinding stones, shell containers, and fire features. People weren't just collecting color, they were making it, mixing it with animal fat or plant oils to create paint or body decoration. It's unknown exactly how they used these materials, whether for personal adornment, social identification, or ritual, but the control of color through heat is undeniable. Fire allowed early humans to externalize thought, to paint meaning onto surfaces, to decorate their identities. With every new discovery, it opened doors to expression, to planning, to beauty. And so, over tens of thousands of years, fire became something far larger than a survival mechanism. It was the forge of human ingenuity, the quiet partner in every act of invention. It taught patience, it taught control, and it rewarded experimentation. In the orange glow of coals, people didn't just warm their bodies, they envisioned what could be changed, what could be made, and in doing so, they laid the foundation for every transformation that would follow. The shaping of metal, the firing of pottery, the building of cities. But it all began here, with a spark struck from stone and a breath coaxed into flame. It began with people like you and me, kneeling beside firelight, watching it flicker, and thinking, what else can this do? In time, the fire's glow began to shape, not just the inside of shelters, but the pattern of life across whole landscapes. As groups grew and moved, they carried with them not only the skills of hunting and foraging, but the memory of fire, how to build it, where to place it, when to keep it low, and when to let it roar. It became the invisible map between people and place. Certain valleys were remembered for good firewood. Certain caves were known to trap smoke or hold heat better in the deep frost. The world wasn't just wilderness anymore. It was a network of known places, marked not by signs but by flame. Even seasonal migration, for some bands, revolved around familiar hearth sites. The fire came with them, or waited for their return. You can almost see it, a group emerging onto a wind-blown plateau at dusk, the sky stained with dying light, and in the distance, faint at first, a flicker of orange behind a wall of boulders. A remembered fire circle, the stones blackened, cracked from past use, ash scattered like old snow. It's there that they settle again, and maybe there too they bury their dead. The hearth becomes more than utility. It becomes anchor, a place where the group knows who they are, where stories begin, and where they return. In this way, fire became a kind of memory keeper, not just for individuals, but for communities. Its presence told them they were somewhere known, somewhere held. As different groups encountered one another, Neanderthals, Homo sapiens, perhaps even other hominin species, still unknown to us, fire may have served as both a signal and a bridge. A distant column of smoke on the horizon might trigger caution or curiosity. Did it belong to friend or rival, a new group, someone who spoke like you, or someone who didn't speak at all, and yet the flame was familiar? A common language, no matter the shape of the people around it. The fire acted the same. It burned upward. It warmed the hands. It softened the meat. And so perhaps around shared fires, exchanges began, of materials, stories, gestures, glances. Fire brought people together before there were borders, before there were nations, before we even knew what we would one day become. In places like Dolní Věstonice in the Czech Republic, dating back nearly 30,000 years, large hearths have been found alongside clay figurines, mammoth bones, and communal shelters. These weren't random clusters of survival. They were early villages, shaped by firelight. The central hearth wasn't just for warmth. It was social gravity, a place to gather, to make plans, to share food, to shape clay. In fact, the figurines found there, some of the earliest known fired ceramics, suggest that people were experimenting with fire, not only to harden tools, but to express something deeper. A woman's figure, a lion, a handprint in the clay. These weren't just objects. They were ideas, made permanent by heat. Fire made them endure. And that's one of fire's most powerful gifts, endurance. A meal disappears. A conversation fades. But an object fired in flame survives for millennia. The earliest kilns were not complex structures, but simple pits dug in the ground, packed with dung and wood, burning slow and hot. Yet even this was enough to turn clay into stone, to take soft earth and make it immortal. What was once shaped by hand and water became something that could pass through generations. The fire gave permanence to the moment. It gave memory a body. And even today, archaeologists kneeling in the dirt are guided by what fire left behind. Charcoal flecks, burned bones, potsherds, heat-altered stone. Evidence not just of life, but of thought. And in the quiet hours, when the work was done and the fire burned low, the people would sit, not always speaking, not always awake, just watching the coals, the stars beyond. Maybe someone would hum, maybe a story would be told, maybe nothing would happen at all, except the slow crackle of a branch collapsing into orange. That too was part of it. Fire didn't just change the world through invention. It also gave people permission to stop, to sit still, to feel, to be near one another without fear. That's the part we often forget, that some of humanity's earliest peace came not from silence or shelter or food, but from a simple fire burning safely through the night. There was comfort in the ritual of tending the fire. Every morning, someone would stir the ashes, checking for coals still alive, still glowing red beneath the gray. If they were lucky, a single puff of breath would coax the ember into a whisper of flame. If not, the work would begin again, splitting, kindling, striking sparks, watching for that moment when a wisp of smoke signaled success. This routine, repeated daily across years and lifetimes, was more than maintenance, it was caretaking, a quiet form of devotion, not to a god, but to the delicate line between cold and warmth, night and morning. The hands that built the fire were building the day itself, and in that task there was dignity. Children likely grew up measuring time in flames, not hours or minutes, but in the color of firelight. The golden brightness of the cook fire, the low red of the sleeping embers, the smoke curling through the morning air, mixing with birdsong, the smell of singed fur, of boiled roots, of fat sizzling on hot stones. These were the constants of their world. While the forests changed and the herds moved, the fire remained. It gave them a sense of order, of return. It was always there when they woke, always there at the end of a hard hunt, always there when they gathered under the hides, pressed close for warmth. A child's first memory might not have been a parent's face, but the sound of a log collapsing into embers and the hush that followed. This emotional bond with fire went deeper than practicality. Over time, it became part of how early humans understood themselves. The firelight showed them their own shadows. It painted them against the walls. It let them see their faces, not just in water or polished stone, but in motion, in warmth. Around the hearth, people came to recognize their own expressions, the shape of grief, the glint of laughter. These moments, magnified by flame, were rehearsals for identity, for empathy, for memory. Fire let them watch themselves becoming human, and it let them see each other more clearly, perhaps for the first time. In that light, the concept of family may have deepened. Not just genetic bonds or survival partnerships, but the quieter layers, comfort, connection, the pleasure of shared silence. Around fire, there was no need to move quickly, no need to speak constantly. People could just exist together in warmth. They could pass around a piece of meat, hand off a child, tend a wound, braiding a girl's hair, sharpening a blade. All of this happened in that soft, shared glow. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't heroic, but it was everything. These were the moments where humanity took root, not in the hunt, not in the fire starting, but in the sitting, the staying, the being with one another. And because fire was so central, it carried meaning across generations. Maybe a father taught his son not just how to spark a flame, but when. To wait until the air was dry, to test the wind, to whisper to the tinder, not shout at it. These lessons weren't written down, they were lived. And when the old ones died, the fire still carried their memory. You could do as they did, use their stones, their rhythms, their voice in your hands. This is how fire became legacy. A kind of quiet inheritance, passed down, not in words, but in smoke, in soot, in calloused fingers. You didn't need to say their names. You only had to build the fire the way they had, and they were with you again. There's something incredibly moving in that. In the idea that tens of thousands of years ago, a group of people, huddled in the dark, surrounded by predators and cold, still found time to light a fire, not just for heat, but for each other, to laugh, to rest, to remember, to sit close and let the glow remind them that they belong to the earth, to each other, to the long ongoing story of being human. The flame made that possible. And even now, as you listen, wherever you are, that same story continues. Not just in the words, but in the quiet between them, in the breath, in the warmth you imagine. That is the echo of their fire, still burning. There was a rhythm to fire that matched the human body. The way it breathed, pulsed, flickered, it aligned with the beat of a heart, the rise and fall of a chest in sleep. It was never truly still. Even when low and quiet, the embers moved like living things, glowing, shifting, responding to the smallest stir of air. This rhythm entered people. You could feel it in your bones as you lay on a fur near the fire, your back warm, the rest of the cave cool. The longer you watched, the more the mind quieted. Thoughts slowed. The sharp edges of the day softened. In a world without clocks or electric light, fire became the great pacemaker of the night. Its lullaby was the low pop of wood, the quiet hiss of resin, the occasional rise of flame licking the air. Smell, too, was transformed by fire. Not just the scent of burning wood, but the deeper layers, the green bite of pine needles, the must of damp moss catching fire too slowly, the greasy sweetness of roasted marrow. Every wood carried its own voice. Some cracked and snapped. Some smoked silently. Others released bursts of fragrance that filled the shelter like incense. Perhaps people learned to choose their fuel, not only by what was available, but by what felt right, what smelled like home. Smoke became an identity. It clung to clothing, to hair, to skin. You could smell a stranger and know where they had camped, what they had cooked, whether they had stayed near oak groves or wandered into birch stands. The nose was a storyteller, and fire was its language. The glow of fire reshaped the way people saw. Daylight was expansive, revealing every crevice and corner, but firelight was selective. It hid as much as it showed. It focused the eye, made shadows dance, turned familiar objects mysterious. A hand lifted near the flames would become enormous, animal-like. A stone tool, its edge gleaming, could look like a tooth. This trick of the light stirred something deep in the imagination. It gave rise to stories, not just factual memories of the day's hunt, but the layered dreams of the mind. A story told in firelight became something more than information. It became experience. You could see it, feel it. The shadows helped build the world behind the words. And then there was sound. The fire was never silent. In the quietest caves, where even the wind was hushed, the fire still spoke. It crackled and shifted, sang its own unpredictable melody. Over time, the sounds became familiar. A sharp crack meant a wet knot in the wood. A low, constant roar meant a well-fed flame. A sudden collapse of coals was a reminder to stir, to shift the logs. These sounds became cues for action, but they also became comfort. You didn't need to look to know the fire was still alive. You could hear it. It was the soundtrack to sleep, to conversation, to thought, to dreams. Just as the ocean whispers to those who live near it, so the fire whispered to the people of the ancient world. That whisper likely inspired more than survival. It may have inspired ritual. In some regions, archaeological finds suggest that people built separate fire pits, not for cooking, but for ceremony. Burned bones placed intentionally. Ash layers built up in complex patterns. Perhaps they marked seasonal transitions. Perhaps they honored the dead. Or perhaps they simply marked the passage of time, of being together. Fire was a boundary between worlds, light and dark, life and death, waking and dreaming. It made sense that people would use it to honor the unknown, to speak into the silence, to imagine what came before and what might come after. And so, in every flicker, every wisp of smoke, every pile of ash, there lived a connection, a thread stretching backward through time. Fire tied the body to the earth, the mind to memory, the moment to meaning. It wasn't just what humans created, it was what allowed them to become. And even now, as you picture it, your own mind warmed by imagined flames, you can feel the echo of that connection. You are not separate from them. You are not distant. You are part of the same story. A single spark passed hand to hand through 100,000 years, and now, gently, it rests with you. Long before the word existed, fire was a kind of medicine. It didn't just soothe the cold, it fought off what couldn't be seen. In damp, shaded places, bacteria and mold could grow in skins and meat. Smoke helped keep that danger away. It dried out shelters, preserved food, and reduced rot. And in a time when the smallest infection could be fatal, this simple benefit became a quiet revolution. Smoked hides lasted longer. Smoked meat fed more. A fire at the center of a home made it harder for parasites to thrive. It changed the air, warded off biting insects, and made wounds easier to keep dry. People didn't know the science, but they knew the pattern. They knew that where fire lived, illness shrank. This meant that fire also shaped how long people lived. While survival in prehistory was always fragile, communities with fire likely saw more elders reach old age. And that mattered, because the presence of elders meant the presence of memory, living archives of seasons, migrations, and dangers. They remembered the lean years, the hidden springs, the times when herds moved earlier than expected. Fire didn't just help individuals survive the night. It helped cultures survive across time. It allowed for a kind of continuity that had never existed before. Not in fossils, not in instinct, but in story, passed down by firelight, guarded by wrinkled hands. And those elders, in turn, shaped the fire's social role. It wasn't only the young who tended it. Often it was the old, those who could no longer hunt, but still held value. They watched the coals, added wood, whispered to children. They became keepers of the flame in the most literal way. In doing so, they remained part of the group, not pushed aside by age, but held close by necessity. In this way, fire made the group whole. It bridged generations. It gave the slowest members a task that was vital, visible, and honored. It was, in a way, the first pension, the first shared purpose beyond the body. In larger groups, fire may have helped shape group identity, a specific way of building it, stacking it, feeding it. These small details became part of who the group was. At archaeological sites, we sometimes see repeated fire structures, with layers of ash laid precisely the same way over many seasons. That pattern tells us something. These weren't chaotic fires. They were consistent, cared for, remembered. Just as languages develop dialects, fires may have developed their own cultural accents. This is how we do it. This is how our fire sounds, how our fire smells. And through that, fire became a kind of fingerprint, a sensory signature of who a people were. The hearth also shaped where people sat, who spoke, who shared. It became a map of interaction. Not everyone could be closest to the flames. That space was often reserved for children, the elderly, or someone ill. The strong took the outer ring, watching, tending, keeping back the dark. In that small arrangement, power could be shared or withheld. Conflict could rise or settle. The hearth was where leadership formed, not in conquest, but in the daily act of sitting, listening, offering food, or saying nothing at all. The dynamics of firelight became the earliest forum, the first round table. You learned who others were by how they sat beside the flame. And so fire created not just heat and light, but structure, community, shared space, and shared roles. The fire wasn't in the center because it had to be. It was in the center because it made the center. Everything, every laugh, every cry, every birth, every death, happened in relation to it. It was the still point in the turning world, and the people who lived in its glow were shaped by it, more than they ever knew. As you sit with this story now, wherever you are, remember, the comfort you feel in firelight is not coincidence. It's memory, old memory, one that lives not just in history, but in the body. The way warmth makes your shoulders drop, the way flame makes you quiet, that's ancient, that's yours. There's something about watching fire that invites the mind to wander. Even now, when we sit beside a flame, the edges of thought blur. Time feels slower. The mind drifts, not into sleep, but into a different kind of focus. That soft in-between place, where ideas come not as commands, but as whispers. It's not hard to imagine that fire, for ancient humans, became a kind of canvas, a frame for dreaming, a place where thoughts could leap beyond the immediate needs of food or danger and move into something else, something imagined. Perhaps that's where art was born, not from necessity, but from stillness, from looking into flame and seeing not just light, but visions. Around the fire, people may have started to shape stories, not just about the hunt or the weather, but about things unseen, spirits, ancestors, beings of shadow and wind. Fire made these things feel close. It cast strange shapes on the walls, turned silence into tension. A flicker of light became an animal's eye. A burst of sparks became the stars. In this quiet theater, people may have begun to weave explanations for the world around them. Not scientific ones, but emotional ones. Stories with meaning, with pattern, with purpose. These early myths, shaped in the glow of coals, gave comfort, gave structure, gave mystery. They were never written, but they were remembered. And perhaps the first music came from this space too. The human voice, rising and falling to the rhythm of flame, a chant, a hum, a steady beat, tapped on bone or hide. Fire gave permission for repetition, for rhythm. There are no distractions in the dark, only the pulse of sound and light. In that space, people may have clapped, drummed, sung together. Music would have echoed in the cave, bounced off stone, wrapped around the people like smoke. No words were needed at first, just tone, pattern, call and response, laughter, breath. These were the beginnings, not just of entertainment, but of shared feeling, a rhythm you could move to, a sound that told you we are here together. Even carving might have begun by firelight. The first time someone took a stone and scratched a mark into bone, not out of utility, but out of curiosity. It was likely near a fire. The light showed texture, showed contrast, a sharp point on a blackened bone. One mark became 2, then 10. Maybe they counted something. Maybe they just liked the pattern. Either way, fire made it possible to see those marks, to share them. Maybe to show them to a child, to say, look, this is mine, or this means something. From that tiny act, the long thread of symbolic thought began to spin, from marks to symbols, from symbols to language, from language to memory. And perhaps firelight was also the first time people saw themselves as different from everything else. Animals gathered warmth from the sun. They followed their instincts, lived in rhythm with the seasons. But humans made fire, carried it, changed it, controlled it. That control sparked a different kind of thinking, not just survival, but identity. We are the ones who shape the flame. We are the ones who gather around it. We are the ones who dream beside it. That subtle shift between being in the world and changing the world was the beginning of culture, and it began with hands reaching toward the glow. That's what makes fire so different from other tools. A hand axe, a spear, a shelter. They are useful, yes, but fire changed how people thought, how they felt. It created the space where ideas could emerge. It allowed them to pause, to listen to themselves, to each other. It slowed the pace of fear. It opened a door inside the mind, and once that door opened, it never closed. You can still feel it now when you stare at a candle, when you hear wood crackle, when your body leans toward warmth. That isn't just comfort, that's memory. The same flicker they watched, the same silence they shared, carried across time, waiting for you. As humans began to move beyond the places where they first appeared, fire went with them, across savannas, through dense forests, over snowy passes and stony plains. Fire was carried not just in hands but in memory, bundled in moss, hidden in bark, cradled in ash-lined pots. A single ember could mean the difference between life and death. And so, in every migration, in every uncertain step forward, fire was the one certainty they could carry. It wasn't just a flame. It was the story of where they had been, a small piece of home that could be lit again in a new place. When they crossed rivers and climbed ridges, fire crossed and climbed with them. It's humbling to think that when the first Homo sapiens began moving north from Africa into the Middle East around 100,000 years ago, they likely did so with fire already mastered, not just as a reaction to cold, but as a companion to the unknown. They entered new biomes with plants they didn't recognize, animals they'd never seen, skies that moved differently, but the fire stayed familiar. The rhythm of tending it, the feel of flint between fingers, the rituals around cooking and sleep. These grounded them. Fire was the bridge between continents, between ancestors and children, between the familiar and the yet-to-be-known. In places like the Levant, fire use became even more refined. Caves like Taboon and Skul, used by both Neanderthals and early Homo sapiens, show signs of continuous hearth use, layer upon layer of ash, stacked like the pages of a book, each line holding traces of meals eaten. Winters survived, stories whispered. Those ashes tell us something essential. That fire wasn't just a tool brought into a new place. It became the place, a marker of presence, of return. Perhaps, after years apart, different bands would find one another again, by finding the fire circles they'd once shared, like old friends, drawn back to a familiar trail of smoke. As people pushed deeper into Europe, fire became even more essential. The Ice Age was unforgiving. Forests of birch and pine loomed over frozen earth, and the wind carried death in its breath. But people survived. In places like Grotte Chauvet, they didn't just endure. They created. Those painted animals, hidden deep in the rock, were brought to life by firelight. The flicker of torches danced across the walls, making bison leap and lions prowl. This wasn't random. It was a planned, shared experience. They didn't bring fire into those spaces just for light. They brought it for transformation. It was their brush, their breath, their voice. Even as people spread east into Central Asia, into the high plateaus and beyond, the fire never left their side. In places where wood was rare, they burned dried dung, or grasses, or animal fat. They learned to adapt the flame to whatever the land would allow, and in doing so, they didn't just conquer the landscape, they collaborated with it. Fire became a negotiation between human need and natural possibility, a constant conversation. It taught patience. It required respect. You couldn't rush it. You couldn't command it. You had to listen to it. And in that way, fire made every person a student, no matter how far from home they roamed. And so the world was lit, one ember at a time, from the Horn of Africa to the mountains of Georgia, from the river valleys of China to the coasts of Spain. Fire traced the footsteps of humanity. Long before there were cities or borders, there were fires glowing in the dark, small flickering promises that someone was there, someone had endured, someone had shaped the night. And when you step outside today and catch the scent of smoke on the wind, or light a match in the quiet, you're reaching across tens of thousands of years to touch that same thread. It hasn't broken. It still glows, just beneath the ash. When we look back across the ages, it's easy to imagine that early humans were isolated, small bands scattered across a vast wild earth. But fire reveals a different truth. Even when thousands of miles apart, separated by oceans, forests, or ice, people were doing the same thing, tending flames. In Africa, in Europe, in Asia, everywhere that human footprints appear in ancient soil, fire marks appear beside them, scorched stone, burned bone, charcoal layers blackening the earth. These weren't coordinated acts. They were echoes of shared necessity. Yes, but also of shared thought. Fire was one of the earliest signs that human experience, across time and geography, was deeply connected. This parallel discovery speaks to something powerful. On distant continents, under unfamiliar stars, people began doing the same things with flame. Cooking food, softening hides, heating rocks, burning brush to attract game. These patterns repeat not because they were copied, but because they were true. Fire answered the same questions, again and again. How do we stay warm? How do we stay fed? How do we see the night? In answering those questions, people who would never meet, people divided by mountain ranges, deserts, generations, created the same solutions. And in that, they created the first human common ground, a quiet unity, written in ash. Even in Australia, where modern humans arrived around 65,000 years ago, perhaps even earlier, we find traces of fire use right from the start. Controlled burns shaped the land, cleared pathways, brought certain plants into bloom. The people there, with their own myths and languages, understood fire as a gift and a responsibility. Aboriginal fire practices, still passed down today, show a refinement and knowledge that stretches back unbroken across millennia. And in the Arctic North, where firewood was scarce and the wind could rip flesh from bone, people burned blubber, bones, anything that could give heat. There, fire became a lesson in resourcefulness, how to make light where light had no business being. This consistency, the near universal mastery of fire, may have played a role in what some call the human explosion. That sudden burst, around 40,000 years ago, when tools, art, trade, and complex social behaviors began to flourish at once. Fire didn't cause it alone, but it lit the way. With fire, people stayed up later, gathered more often, shared more stories, made more plans. It wasn't just about warmth, it was about time. Fire gave people time to talk, to think, to imagine. And from that imagination came painting, music, jewelry, ritual. Things not tied directly to survival, but to meaning. Fire was the seedbed of culture. It also created memory, not just in the mind, but in the land itself. People returned to the same fire sites year after year, building ash rings into the soil, staining the rocks with soot. These were not temporary stops. They were places of return, of gathering, of grounding. Archaeologists can trace generations through these layers. Thick deposits of black and white, where meals were cooked, tools shaped, lives lived. In a world where everything else changed, weather, animals, terrain, the fire remained in place. It became the spine around which stories were told. And when people moved on, the next generation would find it waiting. This is what makes fire more than survival. It makes it history, not written in words or carved into stone, but lived in circles of warmth, passed from hand to hand. A shared instinct, a human thread. And even now, when you sit by a fire and feel yourself drawn inward, when your thoughts soften, your body loosens, your mind opens, that isn't just comfort, that is recognition. Somewhere deep inside, your ancestors are still with you, sitting beside you, holding a stick in the coals, watching sparks rise into the sky. It's not imagination, it's inheritance, and it's still glowing. There are places in the world where you can still see the stars, the way our ancestors once did, clean, sharp, unbroken by electric light. Under those skies, fire feels even more ancient. It glows low against the dark earth, while above, the heavens stretch cold and endless. It's not hard to understand why early people might have looked from one flame to another, from the fire in front of them to the fire in the sky. Maybe they wondered if they were connected. Maybe they believed they were the same. Fire below, fire above, one you could hold, one you could only watch. It's possible that in those quiet comparisons, the first spiritual thoughts were kindled. The stars flickered like coals. They moved in patterns, rising, falling, marking time. Fire on the ground did the same. It faded, returned, pulsed with wind and breath. That rhythm may have made early humans feel that they were part of something larger, something living. The fire wasn't just a tool anymore. It was part of a story that stretched beyond the cave mouth, beyond the edge of the forest, beyond the hill. It lit not just their homes, but their questions. And in lighting those questions, fire became something sacred, revered not out of fear, but out of awe. We'll never know for sure how those early people spoke of fire, what words they used, what myths they whispered. But we can imagine. Maybe they believed it was stolen from an animal spirit, or gifted by a sky being. Maybe it was the soul of the earth itself, breaking through the surface to remind them they weren't alone. Myths like these appear across the world. Fire as divine, as dangerous, as powerful. Whether told by the Sen of southern Africa or the Maori of New Zealand, the story often involves trial, courage, and transformation. Fire must be earned. Fire must be respected, and it must never be taken for granted. In this way, fire also taught restraint. You couldn't shout it into life. You couldn't demand it. It didn't always obey. You had to prepare. Gather the right materials. Be gentle, patient, aware. In teaching people how to start fire, elders weren't just passing on technique, they were passing on a mindset, a way of approaching the world with care. Not everything could be controlled, but everything could be approached with humility. That lesson echoed into other parts of life. Hunting, child rearing, storytelling, fire became the quiet teacher behind every lesson. And in the moments when fire didn't come, when the wood was too damp, the flint too dull, the wind too strong, people were reminded of their place. Even now, we've all had that feeling, the match that won't catch, the lighter that sparks but doesn't hold. In that small frustration lives a great truth, that the flame is never owed. It is always a gift, something given, not guaranteed. For early people, that meant vigilance, gratitude, a respect for what could be lost. That mindset, that reverence, shaped their entire worldview. It created cultures, built not just on dominance, but on balance. So the fire burned, yes, but it also listened. It reflected the people around it, their moods, their skill, their stories. It was never just flame, it was a mirror, a guide, a silent witness. And it continues even now. Maybe you've felt it, that moment when you stare into fire and feel not just calm but connection, a thread to something older, something wiser. That's not nostalgia. That's not fantasy. That's recognition. Your ancestors are there, in the glow, in the silence, in the warmth. And so are you. Outside the ring of firelight, the world was never safe. Night brought predators, sharp-toothed, silent, patient. Their eyes glinted from the edges of the dark. Lions larger than today's, dire wolves that ran in packs, hyenas bold enough to follow a scent into camp. The moment the sun dipped below the horizon, the rules of survival changed. But inside the circle of warmth and light, people held the edge. Fire wasn't just a tool, it was a wall, a moving barrier between safety and everything that wished them harm. And so every night someone watched the coals, not just to feed the flame, but to hold back the dark. Children grew up understanding that line. Beyond the glow, anything could be waiting. So they stayed close to the heat, sat with their backs to the stone, their ears tuned to the sounds of night, the crunch of snow, the distant cry of an owl, the echo of something stepping where no human should be. But the fire calmed them. Its constant presence, the way it crackled, hissed, shifted, gave shape to the unknown. Even when danger pressed close, the fire said, "Here is the limit. Here is the line they won't cross." And more often than not, it was right. In time, the animals learned too. Fire was unnatural. It smelled wrong. It moved when it shouldn't. Even the boldest carnivores hesitated at the edge of flame. There are stories passed down even into modern indigenous cultures of how fire wasn't just a defense, but a partner in survival. Used to herd animals, to scare off predators, to create a moment's hesitation long enough to escape. In the oldest parts of the human mind, this knowledge still lingers. Even now, when you camp in the wild and light a fire, something in your bones relaxes. The fear eases, because the fire is watching. But fire didn't only protect from physical danger. It protected from something harder to name. Fear itself, the kind that comes in silence, in uncertainty, in memory. After a failed hunt, after a burial, after a fight, fire offered comfort in those moments too. It didn't need to speak. It didn't need to solve anything. It simply was, constant, unmoving, a place to sit and not be alone. And sometimes, that was enough. It let the grief settle, let the sorrow breathe. People could cry near the fire without shame. They could sing to the dead. They could sit in silence, and the flame would flicker gently, without judgment. Over time, this gave fire another role, one of healing, not physical healing. Though warmth surely helped aching bones and cold-bitten skin, but emotional healing. The chance to stop moving, to stop hunting, to stop fighting. Fire created a kind of emotional perimeter. Inside it, people could release the weight they carried. Talk about the loss of a friend. Laugh about a moment from the past. Braid grass into twine, while telling a story that had been told 100 times before. These moments didn't feed the body, but they fed the soul. And fire always was at the center. That's the part we often forget. Fire wasn't just survival, it was sanctuary. It offered warmth, not just for the skin, but for the spirit. A light in the long dark. A reminder that danger could be held at bay. Not forever, but long enough to rest. Long enough to dream. And even now, that truth holds. In every fireplace, every candle, every flickering screen we gather around, there is something deeper at work. Something older. A signal that this is the place to let go. That here, in the glow, you are safe. Every day began with fire. Not a roaring flame, but the gentle stirring of yesterday's ash. The careful search for a single glowing coal beneath the gray. There was no rushing this. Hands moved slowly. A stick to prod the bed. A breath to test the ember. If it glowed, a smile. If not, more work. Flint against pyrite. Soft curls of dry grass. The rhythmic strike, strike, strike. The moment it caught, smoke curling upward. Then a whisper of flame was like waking the heart of the home. Others would stir, eyes still heavy, pulling furs closer as the cold retreated. And just like that, the day had begun. The first task was always heat. A pot placed on a flat stone, water warming slowly. Bits of dried root or leaf stirred in to soften, to flavor, to calm. Meat from the night before added back to the flame, brought back to life. Children huddled nearby, not for hunger, but for the warmth. The smoke curled upward into the rafters of the shelter, or toward the cracks in the cave ceiling, and the air began to smell like life again. The embers glowed more brightly as larger logs were added, and the cold slowly crept backward, out beyond the stone, beyond the hide walls, back into the wilderness where it belonged. Even when the camp moved, fire remained at the center. A traveling hearth might be smaller, simpler. A bundle of coals wrapped in moss and bark, carried by someone careful. But it was still there, still sacred. A spark from the last fire used to light the next. There was something meaningful in that continuity. One fire becoming another, a thread unbroken. The group might be miles from where they slept before, but the flame would be familiar, its smell, its sound, its color. In that way, fire gave the people a sense of identity that went beyond place. It wasn't the cave or the shelter that made a home. It was the hearth, the glow, the circle. And within that circle, life unfolded in small rhythms. Someone chipped stone, each strike echoing softly. Someone else sharpened bone needles. Children played with sticks, copying what they'd seen their parents do. A girl braided dried grass, tightening it slowly into a cord for binding furs. An elder mended a tear in a hide garment. These weren't grand rituals. They were daily ones. Quiet, repetitive, grounding. The kind of work that shapes a life, not in bursts of invention, but in care, in attention, in rhythm. And the fire burned through it all, keeping time without ever speaking. At night, when work was done and the light began to fade, the fire changed again. It softened. The bright yellow of day gave way to a deeper red, a quieter glow. People gathered closer. No need to speak, just the creak of someone shifting, the low breath of someone half asleep. Sometimes a story was told, sometimes not. The fire didn't require anything. It was simply there. Enough. The way the embers pulsed, slow, steady, matched the rhythm of thought, of memory, of sleep. And slowly, one by one, people closed their eyes. The fire, like a watchful parent, stayed awake a little longer. And in the morning, the ritual began again. A stick, a breath, a coal still warm beneath the ash. Life returning, not in a rush, but in a hum, a rhythm, a shared beginning. And as you listen now, eyes heavy, body still, maybe you can feel that same rhythm, the quiet repetition of breath, the soft warmth of stillness. You're part of that same thread, that same circle. And somewhere in the long memory of your body, the fire still glows. Around the fire, words began to stretch. Not just short calls or urgent commands, but full thoughts, sentences, descriptions. The safety of the flame allowed time for the slower kind of speech, the kind that didn't need to warn or direct, but to share, to wonder, to remember. Maybe language didn't grow in the chase, or the hunt, or the fight, but in the stillness that came after, when bodies rested, minds wandered, and the fire offered the space to speak without fear. In the shadows and the warmth, early people may have learned to speak of things not present, things imagined, things long past. Children learned first by listening. Their earliest memories weren't just of the flame itself, but of the voices around it, the slow hum of a story, the repetition of a name, a laugh that rose and fell like a melody. These were the first teachers, not with chalk or books, but with warmth and sound. A child curled beside a parent, hearing the same story every night, until the words became their own, until they could speak it back, change it, add to it. That was how language grew, not in silence, but in circles, in echoes, passed from mouth to ear like a torch, passed from hand to hand. And fire helped those words stay. It gave them weight. A story told while walking could be forgotten, but a story told in the firelight, with gestures, with rhythm, with eyes locked across the glow, that story stayed. It lived in the mind differently, became part of the body, carried in muscle and breath. Even now, we know this. We tell stories by firelight still, and they feel deeper, older, more true. There's something in the flicker that holds attention, something in the warmth that softens resistance. Fire makes us listen. It always has. Language wasn't just about survival. It became comfort, a way to soothe a crying child, to reassure someone returning from a hunt, to sing while preparing food. Words became tools of care, of closeness. And in this, fire and language moved together. Each made the other stronger. Without fire, there might not have been space for quiet, for listening. Without language, the fire would have burned alone. But together, they created something lasting, a way for humans to shape the world, not just with their hands, but with their minds. And as stories became more complex, they began to carry more than information. They carried values, beliefs, warnings, dreams. A tale told to explain why the stars move. A memory of a winter so cold it turned rivers solid. A teaching wrapped in metaphor. How fire came from the sky, or from the belly of an animal, or from the courage of a single child. These weren't just entertainment. They were survival in a different sense. Survival of thought, of identity. They gave people something to return to when the world turned uncertain. Something that glowed inside, even when the fire outside had dimmed. And you, now, listening in your own time, are part of that same pattern. You are receiving a story, not carved in stone, not spoken in haste, but gently, carefully, like an ember cupped in two hands. Words shaped by memory, by breath, by rhythm, carried across ages to reach you here. The fire is still burning, maybe not with logs or sparks, but in the quiet weight of the voice, in the stillness that surrounds it, in the warmth you feel, even if only in your mind. Fear was never far from the lives of early humans. It lived in the howl of wind, the snap of a branch, the ache of hunger, the deep silence of a night with no sounds at all, but fear softened around fire. Not all at once, not completely, but enough to breathe, enough to rest your shoulders, loosen your grip, close your eyes without panic. That glow, low and pulsing, gave permission to feel other things, things fear normally silenced. It allowed space for comfort, for sadness, for joy, for grief. The fire didn't erase danger, but it made room beside it. And in that room, people could feel more than just survival. In the warmth of firelight, people didn't have to be strong all the time. A hunter could sit quietly, head low, tired and aching. A mother could cry without looking away. A child could lean into someone else and simply be held. These were not signs of weakness. They were signs of trust. Fire didn't demand bravery. It welcomed truth. And over time, that truth became part of the group's strength, the ability to gather not just in triumph, but in uncertainty, to return from the world outside, where things were fast and cold and sharp, and be softened again, brought back, brought home. This may be where compassion began, not as an abstract ideal, but as a moment. One person handing another a piece of roasted root without being asked, a hand brushing ash from a shoulder, a voice whispering reassurance in the dark. These gestures needed no translation. They were shared through flame, through presence. And in those moments, bonds were formed that would outlast the fire itself. People who had shared warmth, shared more than heat. They shared memory, they shared meaning, and they carried that with them, even when the camp moved, even when the season changed. Fire also marked the passing of time, not in minutes, but in moods. The bright crackling morning flame, the steady work-focused midday coals, the soft whispering embers of night. Each one called for a different way of being. People didn't speak the same way around each. They didn't move the same. And so the fire helped shape, not just behavior, but feeling. It gave the day emotional texture. And in a world without clocks or schedules, that texture mattered. It made life more than just reaction. It made it rhythm, a gentle rise and fall, a pattern you could live by. There's an intimacy in the idea that people sat close enough to feel each other breathe, that their laughter didn't echo but folded into the warmth, that silence wasn't empty, it was accepted, shared, safe. Around the fire, there was no performance, just presence, the sound of someone sharpening a tool, the smell of wood slowly charring, the dim shape of a face lit from below. This is how love might have first been known. Not in words, not in symbols, but in staying, in being there. In the night when all else was uncertain, fire made connection visible. And maybe that's why it still feels sacred. Why we light candles when we grieve. Why we gather around bonfires to celebrate. Why a fireplace can make a room feel like home. The flame doesn't just warm the body. It holds the weight of memory, of feeling, of the long story we've all inherited. And even now, as you lie here listening, that warmth still holds you, not from logs or sparks, but from the steady rhythm of words, the soft glow of thought. You are near the fire, just like they were, and it is enough. There was something about fire that turned empty space into home. A cave was just rock until the first coal was coaxed to life. A clearing was only wind and dirt until the smoke began to rise. Fire didn't just change the air, it changed the meaning of the ground beneath it. Once the hearth was lit, people gathered. They sat, they worked, they stayed, and over time, the fire wasn't just in the center of the camp, it was the center. Everything else spiraled out from it. Sleeping areas, tool piles, drying racks, food storage, each placed in relation to the flame. The fire gave direction, orientation, a sense of inside and out. In the coldest places, fire made the very idea of indoors possible. Stone walls blocked the wind. Furs were stretched over bones, tied down with sinew, packed with mud. But without the fire in the middle, those walls were just barriers. It was the heat, the flickering light, the smoke curling into the rafters that transformed a shelter into a true dwelling. You could hear it before you saw it, the low hum of a burning log, the occasional hiss of sap. You could smell it in the skins, the hair, the ground. It lingered. It marked the space as lived in, as human, as known. In many communities, the hearth became a kind of altar, not of worship perhaps, but of focus. It was where newborns were introduced to the world, where the dead were mourned, where food was offered and divided. The first bite often went to the elders, or perhaps to the flame itself, dropped into the coals as a gift, a habit, a small insurance against misfortune. These actions weren't superstition. They were structure, repetition, a way to make sense of a world that offered no guarantees. When you lit the fire, you weren't just warming your body. You were reconnecting, remembering, re-entering the long story. Over time, certain fires became fixed, not just lit and relit, but permanent. At sites like Dolny Vistonice or Mezirice in Eastern Europe, massive hearths were built and maintained in structured dwellings. Season after season, the fire pits were shaped, lined with stone, surrounded by organized spaces for tools, bones, artwork. These weren't random burn sites. They were designed, considered. The hearth became a landmark. People may have said, "We sleep near the southern fire," or "We meet by the third flame." Fire was no longer just personal. It was communal. It was geography. And even outside the dwellings, fire shaped space. Camps were laid out with the wind in mind, the slope of the land, the availability of dry fuel. A good hearth was protected from rain, open enough to vent smoke, close enough to shared resources. These choices weren't accidental. They were learned, taught, passed down. Over time, the knowledge of how to build a place began with fire, not with walls, not with stone, but with warmth, a center, a promise. Here, we stay. And as those places aged, their fires told time, not in hours, but in ash, in layers, in memory. Even now, you may feel it, the way light changes the feeling of a room, the way a single candle can make a space feel less empty. That isn't aesthetic, that's ancestry. A thread stretching back through time, reminding you that light means safety, that warmth means presence, that flame means you belong. And tonight, as your body rests and your breath slows, imagine that same glow around you, soft, steady, the old kind of light, the kind that turns silence into song and shadow into home. In the stillness between flames, identity began to form, not just the sense of who am I, but who are we. Around the fire, people weren't just individuals, they were part of something larger, a shared task, a shared rhythm, a shared memory. When the fire was lit, it meant that the group had returned, that the tools had come back, that the stories would be told again, that someone still remembered how to strike the flint and shape the wood. It was proof that the people still were, still here, still together. A fire wasn't just survival, it was presence. And with that presence came recognition. Each group had its way of tending the fire, how high it was built, how often it was stirred, what fuel it burned, how it was arranged. Some left it open and tall. Others dug low pits covered in ash to hold heat longer. Some added herbs to the smoke. Others used flat stones to radiate warmth into the sleeping spaces. These small choices became signatures, styles, a way for one group to know another. Perhaps even before they saw the faces, they saw the fire and knew, this is not our people, or perhaps this is someone we remember. And identity was also passed through skill. A boy learning to light a fire the way his father had. A girl mastering how to keep it low in strong wind. The art of flame was not just physical, it was cultural. A song might accompany the lighting, a gesture, a phrase, a blessing. These rituals gave shape to the act, made it more than utility, made it inheritance. And the fire, once lit, was a confirmation of memory. It said, you know this, you were taught this, you are part of something that began long before you, and will continue long after. For those who traveled, fire became their voice in the wilderness. When two groups met under the same sky, far from home, The fire was the first to speak. If they shared food, they cooked it there. If they traded, they sat beside it. If peace was made, it was done in the glow of the same flame. And if conflict arose, fire reminded them of what they risked losing: the comfort, the order, the human light. Some fires were shared for a night. Others marked the beginning of alliances, of interwoven families, of new migrations. The flame burned not just through wood, but through boundaries. And even as humans scattered further into colder zones, higher altitudes, deeper forests, fire was the one piece of their origin that followed. They could leave behind rivers and hills, but not the flame. It was the only constant in a world of change. The same orange glow, the same smell of smoke in hair and skin, the same ritual of sleep gathered close. Fire carried Africa with them, carried the old warmth of home, of memory, of first breath. In every cave where people pressed hands to the wall, in every shelter where meat was softened over heat, in every night that ended with stillness and glow, that memory remained. And you, listening now, carry it too. You are not separate from this line. You are it. Your comfort in warmth, your calm in soft light, your silence in the presence of flickering shadows. That is not coincidence. That is your inheritance. The same glow that once lit the faces of people who had no names now rests quietly in you, not as a fire in the earth, but as one in the mind. A still, gentle warmth, a knowing, a thread that glows quietly, no matter how dark it becomes. Some fires weren't meant to last. They were lit to mark a moment, and when that moment passed, the flame was allowed to die. These were not failures. They were rituals. A fire built for a birth might burn through a single night, fed by careful hands, then left to smolder by dawn. A fire for the dead might be lit in silence, with ash scattered the next morning, like a whisper returned to the earth. These single fires carried immense meaning. They said, this happened, this mattered, not to the world maybe, but to us. And that was enough. In many places, the act of extinguishing the fire became just as sacred as the act of lighting it. It had to be done with care, with intention. A final breath to the coals, a sprinkle of water, a covering of soil. It wasn't just about safety. It was about respect for what the fire had given, for what it had seen. You didn't just walk away from a hearth. You closed it like a door behind you. In that act was a farewell, a promise that the place had been known, that it had been warmed, that it would not be forgotten. Some fires were never meant to go out. They were kept through seasons, through storms, passed between generations. Even today, in some cultures, a family hearth may burn continuously for years. The fire is cleaned, tended, renewed, but not restarted, because its flame is not just heat, it is history. One coal touching another, unbroken through time. And even when the fire is allowed to rest, its memory stays. In the stones, darkened with use. In the walls, lined with smoke. In the hands, that still remember the rhythm of stacking wood and coaxing flame. Perhaps that's why ashes feel so important. They are what's left when everything bright has faded. Not gone, not erased, but changed. The gray powder in the fire pit is not a loss. It is a record of warmth given. Meals cooked, words shared, nights survived. And in those ashes, early humans may have seen something like themselves. Something transformed. Fragile, yes, but still meaningful. A sign that life had passed through this place, had warmed it, had burned, briefly and beautifully. At burial sites across continents, archaeologists have found traces of ash scattered near bones. Some believe it marked the transition from life to something else. Others think it was a way of preparing the ground, cleansing, softening, honoring. In either case, the fire was part of it. Death was not just silence, it was ceremony. The flame, once shared with the living, was given again to the departed, as if to say, you are not going alone. You carry the warmth with you. You carry us with you. And in that flicker, grief softened, not disappeared, but held. So even now, when you light a candle in memory, or watch the last coal glow and go dim, you are participating in something far older than you realize. You are not the first to sit quietly in the dark, watching the light fade. You are not the first to say goodbye beside a fire, and you will not be the last, because the flame, like the story, continues, passed gently from moment to moment, never rushed, never lost, just glowing soft and steady, waiting for someone to breathe life into it again. In the vast darkness of the ancient world, the smallest fire meant hope. A single flicker in the cold could change everything. It meant you weren't alone, that someone had been there before you, that warmth was possible, that morning would come, long before maps or written words. Fire was how people knew they could go further, not because the journey was easy, but because the fire told them, you can survive this. Others have, that glow on a distant hill, or tucked into a cave, or glimmering behind a hide curtain. It was more than signal, it was a promise. And with that promise came movement. Fire made people brave, not in the loud, roaring way, but in the quiet way that endures. It let them step out into unknown terrain, cross rivers, climb ridges, enter forests with no trail. Because they knew, if they could carry the ember, if they could keep that tiny flame alive, they could begin again, build again, light the dark again. Fire didn't remove risk, but it made risk worth taking. It gave people something to protect, something to build around. Even if everything else was lost, the fire could be saved. It also helped people wait. In times of hunger, storm, or danger, the fire gave shape to stillness, a place to gather, to hold back from panic. While the world outside howled, the fire stayed steady. In its glow, people learned to be patient, to listen, to plan. They'd sharpen tools, mend hides, hum softly. There was a wisdom in that slowness, a kind of knowing that said, not everything must be rushed. That waiting could be part of survival. That silence too was a form of strength. The fire was the teacher in that stillness, constant, quiet, never demanding, just there. This quiet steadiness helped shape how people endured sorrow. When food ran out, when a loved one was lost, when the cold cut too deep, the fire didn't erase the ache, but it made space for it. It gave people somewhere to sit with the pain, somewhere to grieve without collapse. And sometimes that was enough, to sit, to feel, to be held by warmth, if not by words. The fire bore witness to every emotion, joy, fear, anger, wonder, and it never turned away. It made room for everything human. Even today, that's what fire gives us. More than heat, more than light. It gives us room to be quiet, to remember, to imagine. And maybe that's why we still gather around it, even with all we've built, even with screens and switches and central heat. The fire remains, in candles, on birthday cakes, in flames lit for the dead, in the slow burn of logs at the center of a family gathering. We don't light fire because we need it. We light it because we recognize it, because it still speaks. And maybe you feel that now. That quiet recognition, that softness, that slowing down. The flame might not be in front of you, but it's here somewhere just beyond your breath. A rhythm you remember, even if you've never lived it. A warmth that feels older than you. It is. It's the oldest part. The part that knew how to keep still, how to keep going, how to carry the light, even when the world turned cold. That's still in you. That's what fire gave. And it has never gone out. Fire didn't need to be explained. It just was. And in its presence, people made meaning. Not because they had to, but because they could. Around the fire, they saw patterns in stars, shapes in smoke, symbols in the way flame danced across a wall. They began to imagine that the world was more than what could be touched. More than just hunger, shelter, cold. That maybe there was something behind the wind, beneath the ground, within the flame. Fire opened a door in the mind, and instead of closing it, people stepped through, not out of fear, but out of wonder. And through that door came everything else. The dreams, the questions, the need to mark a wall with ochre or carve a face into stone, the impulse to place beads with the dead or light a flame before crossing a threshold. These weren't random acts. They were echoes of something deeper, a knowing that life was more than the body, that warmth could hold memory, that flame could carry a name, a story, a farewell. In the crackle of burning wood, early humans didn't just hear comfort. They heard connection to one another, to something larger, to something that watched back. And so fire became sacred. Not in the way we use that word now, but in the older way, in the quiet way. Fire was sacred because it asked nothing and gave everything, because it stayed when the rest of the world changed, because it carried joy and grief with the same quiet breath, and because it taught without speaking how to live with care, how to pause, how to honor, not through ceremony, always, but through presence, through the act of sitting together, saying nothing, and letting the warmth be enough. Over time, this became a rhythm, a way of life. The fire was lit not just to cook or stay warm, but to begin something, the start of the day, the gathering of the group, the sharing of a decision. Even in modern rituals, this echoes still. Lighting a candle to begin a vigil, a flame to open a festival, a fire to mark the turning of the year. These are not new ideas. They are very old. They come from a time when a single glowing coal, fed and guarded, was all a person needed to know they still belonged, that they were part of something unbroken. And that's what makes fire so powerful. It's not just an element, it's a thread. One that connects people across language, land, and time. One that burns through history, not in great leaps, but in the quiet glow of one night at a time. You are part of that thread. Whether you've ever tended a fire or not, whether you've watched sparks rise into a night sky, or simply lit a match in silence, you felt it. That moment when the world seems softer, when the noise falls away, when you remember something you can't name. That's the thread pulling gently at you. That's the story you belong to. And here, in this moment, that thread continues. You're resting in the same rhythm, slowed breath, soft light, a voice in the stillness. You're not at the edge of something, you're at the center. You are the keeper of the ember now, not because you must light a flame, but because you remember what it feels like, what it meant, what it means. That memory, carried in your body, is older than history. It has no language, only warmth, only silence, only the knowing that, somewhere inside you, the fire still glows. We like to think of fire as something from the past, primitive, ancient, maybe even obsolete. But the truth is, we've never let it go. We've just changed the form. The candles we light on birthday cakes, the tiny flame on a stove, the flicker of a match in a dark room, they all trace back to that first breath on a coal, that first pair of hands shielding a spark from the wind. We carry fire now in circuits and wires, in the glow of our screens, in the soft pulse of city lights seen from a plane. But it's still fire, still light in the dark, still warmth against the cold, and we still gather around it, around fireplaces, around lanterns, around glowing televisions and quiet kitchen stoves. Even the simple pull toward conversation around a softly lit table. It's the same rhythm, the same urge to be near the glow. It's not just habit, it's heritage. In every flicker, something in us remembers. Not in words, not even in pictures, but in feeling, in calm, in the quiet release of breath that says, here, we are safe. Here, we are together. The body knows what the mind has forgotten. The flame means home. That's why fire still lives in our language. We talk about burning passion, sparking ideas, fiery tempers, and embers of love. We carry torches for people. We let things smolder. We keep the fire going. Even in metaphor, we trust flame to explain our most intense, most human emotions. Because it fits. Because it's always been there. Fire taught us what intensity was, what presence meant, what it looked like to create something out of nothing. A single strike, a breath, a hand sheltering warmth, and suddenly the world changed. You may not build fires in the wilderness. You may not roast meat over coals or sleep beside a flickering hearth, but still, you carry that memory. When you light a candle without thinking, when you pause to watch smoke rise from a chimney, when you stare into a sunset that paints the sky in orange and gold, that's not just beauty, that's recognition. You're seeing something your ancestors saw. You're touching a piece of their world. And without knowing it, you're keeping it alive. Because the fire doesn't have to be physical. It can be a way of moving through the world, a way of holding stillness, of making space, of honoring presence. It can be the warmth in your voice when you speak to someone with care, the glow of kindness when you sit with someone in silence, the heat of focus when you create something that matters. That's the fire too, just in another form, quiet, enduring, carried forward in everything we do that says, this is worth tending. And tonight, that's what you're doing. Tending the fire, not with wood or flint, but with your stillness, your breath, your willingness to listen and remember. You're holding space for something very old, and in doing that, you're part of a story that stretches further than memory. You are the ember now, and the world, for a moment, is just a little warmer because of it. So the fire burned, and it changed us. It taught us how to wait, how to care, how to pass something fragile from hand to hand, and keep it alive across the dark. It lit our caves, our eyes, our ideas. It burned in the center of everything. Home, story, grief, joy. It taught us rhythm, taught us stillness, taught us the difference between surviving and living. And though the world around us has changed, though the forests have shifted, the stars spun on, and the great animals of the Ice Age have passed into silence, the fire remains. You've walked through that story now. Not in a rush, not with a map, but slowly, one glowing step at a time. You've sat beside the first flame. You've heard the stones strike. You've felt the hush of night and the slow crackle of warmth spreading through the dark. You've seen the flicker of art on a cave wall. You've tasted the oldest comfort, the kind that says you belong here. You always have. And maybe tonight, as you rest in your own space, quiet, eyes soft, body still, you'll feel that ancient warmth beside you. Not from logs or coal or sparks, but from memory, from the rhythm of words, from the hush between them. You've just spent time with your ancestors, not by name, but by feeling, by instinct, by listening. You've shared something sacred, attention, breath, silence. And in that sharing, something has been passed to you, a small glowing ember. You don't need to hold it, you already do. Before we go, I want to thank you for spending this time with me, for trusting this space to guide you deeper into rest, for listening with care. I hope this story has kept you company in a way that feels kind and human and familiar. If it has, I'd love for you to subscribe. And if you're still awake, leave a comment with where you're listening from and what time it is. It's a simple gesture, but it helps us feel close across the distance, like we're sitting around the same fire, under the same sky. For now, I'll leave you in stillness, in warmth. The flame, for tonight, can rest. Good night.